What is complex PTSD? Hi, my name is John Hawkins Jr. I'm a licensed psychotherapist and trauma specialist in South Florida and co-founder of Hawkins Counseling Center. Ever since I got in the field, there's been a lot of confusion about what is actually complex PTSD, otherwise known as CPTSD. When I was my first year as a therapist, I knew right away within a few months that if I wanted to get good at helping people, I had to get good at trauma. It was the underlying condition in some form for what everybody was ultimately struggling with. So I ran across a couple clinicians who were writing about this thing called complex PTSD. I went and talked to clinicians who had been in the field a lot longer than me. No one even knew what I was talking about. They had never heard the term. I was astounded. I thought, how could that possibly be? I'm a 3-month therapist and nobody knows what this actually is. Over the last 15 years, more and more clinicians understand complex PTSD. Tons of research has come out. More and more clients are walking into my office telling me I have CPTSD, another designation for complex PTSD. So today I want to explain to you what CPTSD actually is versus PTSD. So the first thing is differentiating two types of trauma. There's what's called type 1 trauma, which is a single incident trauma. So this would be something like a car wreck, an incident in war, sexual assault. It's a one-off event or just a very brief series of events. This leads to the development of traditional or classic PTSD symptoms. Then there's type 2 trauma, which is more correlated from about 16 down to birth. And this trauma or neglect was more chronic, recurrent, and the biggest impact is it was relational. So this is going to impact somebody in a lot more complex set of impediments and difficulties in their life. So the first of these is difficulty regulating emotions. So emotions are energetic states that are supposed to initiate adaptive action. When we don't get what we need caretaker-wise to help us regulate these states and teach us how to use them, we have to develop certain defenses. So what happens is you either end up, when you start feeling these things, you end up hypo aroused, which is maybe flooded with anxiety, overwhelm. It's what we call sympathetically dominated. Your sympathetic nervous system takes things up. Or you get hypo aroused, so there's low activity. So when the emotions come up, I disassociate, I go flat, numb, disconnect, out of body, maybe things don't seem real, so you become parasympathetically dominated. Or you alternate back and forth in these type of adaptations based on the context of the situation. The second area is what they call somatization. So because all these neurochemicals that we call emotions are in your body, when they get frozen in your body and unprocessed or unreleased into action, you develop certain types of somatic or body symptoms. So one would be things like fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, trauma-induced migraines, trauma-induced asthma, some forms of neuropathy. I'm not saying all asthma and all migraines come from trauma, but a big percentage of my clients have symptoms like these. The third is what's defined as, and this is the most complicated part, which I'll speak to in many other videos, structural disassociation. So when that energy is overwhelming to us and we can't regulate it in the case of abuse, terror, fear, helplessness, that energy will come up and cause cellular death to the upper brain. So the brain down here in the brainstem floods with natural opiates, splits that off to the side so we can keep functioning. Now, a part of this, this isolated network is holding the trauma. And like I said, this is the most complicated part of the whole thing. The fourth area is what is defined as an impaired sense of self. So a lot of parts of us are going to be holding feelings of shame or worthlessness or lack of an identity because I never really got to get the attachment I need and the emotional regulation help I need to form a psychological sense of who I am and have a true identity that is not shame-based. The fifth area, and this is the one that I think is the most challenging for people, is relational difficulties. Because most of these forms of neglect, trauma, abuse were perpetuated by people who were supposed to be safe people, caretakers, family, friends. So there's a deep relational wound. And this is one of the areas that really differentiates CPTSD from PTSD. So what happens on a neurological level is your attachment system and your defenses get fused together. In neuroscience, there's an expression that neurons that fire together wire together. So they get activated or you form patterns of behavior or parts of the personality where one wants to reach for attachment and the other one wants to get away from it because it's threatening. So for a child, they call it in child development, fright without solution. That when the source of safety becomes the threat, it's terrifying for the child. Now, there's a lot of misdiagnosis in addition to PTSD. So sometimes people will get diagnosed with single incident PTSD when they actually have complex PTSD. Other things that will really get misdiagnosed as CPSD are bipolar disorder, forms of ADHD, in childhood conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, major depressive disorder, because when there's a lot of shame in the system and there's dissociative shutdowns, this can drive forms of depression. Or if you're switching in and out of different networks that you had to split off from trauma, you seem very erratic or manic or bipolar or shut down. And so I would say, in my experience as a trauma specialist, probably, I would say roughly 80% of the people that get diagnosed with bipolar disorder actually have CPTSD. So treatments for CPTSD are one of the reasons people don't get help. Sometimes clients come to me after decades of therapy and trying to get help, and they have internalized the belief that it's impossible for them to heal, or they can't do some of these therapies. The problem is talk therapy can't resolve any of these symptoms. You have to do deeper work that actually creates neuroplasticity. But the brain, the nervous system are rewired to reset itself, to heal itself. It is possible to get help. It is possible to recover from CPTSD. It is a journey. I'm not going to sugarcoat that it's not challenging or difficult, but it is resolvable if you get the right kind of help. It's really challenging in the mental health field because they look at symptoms and they create clusters of symptoms, and then they give you a diagnosis. So again, things like panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, some of these things get diagnosed at that, when they're really ultimately, if you understand what's going on at a biological level, is forms of CPTSD or different, maybe more complex PTSD. And there's an epidemic of undiagnosed CPTSD because it gets misdiagnosed as all these other things. Two great resources for you to understand some of these differentiations I'm talking about: a book called The Body Bears the Burden by Dr. Robert Scare, who's a neurologist, that really speaks to this. The other is The Body Keeps a Score by Bessel van der Kolk. A lot more of my clients come in already with this book. So, it's been optimistic for me to see more and more education, information in the general culture around what CPTSD is. That's the reason I'm doing these videos, is just to get information out there. I found there's just a real deficit in accurate information. And then in psychology, we have what's called differential diagnosis. So if you get all these incorrect diagnoses, then you can't get the proper treatment. When I started in the field and I would read clients' charts, I worked at a mental health hospital, and there would just be 9 diagnoses. And I thought to myself, how is that possible when half of these diagnoses are the exact same symptoms? But through neuroscience, neurobiology, now we understand what is happening inside somebody's brain and body. So I hope this information was helpful to you. Again, there's gonna be more videos coming speaking to the complexity of things like structural disassociation, or definitely treatments, coping things that you can use in the interim while you're in your healing process, and then any questions that people send me want to respond to. If you have any additional questions, you can reach me at john@hawkinscounselingcenter.com, or you can check out some of the free resources we have on hawkinscounselingcenter.com.